Part 1. Vocation. Via Crucis. The sculpture in the corner is dark, the color of wet earth. Rising 3 feet or so above its pedestal, it could be the model of a tower or a not-gnarled tree. In fact, it is a tangle of bodies, a doll-scale depiction of a scene usually associated with souls in eternal torment. Bare arms, legs, and torsos wrapped around one another, grabbing and kicking as if being pulled from below. Pained faces staring out in every direction. From a distance, the piece looks almost accidental, protuberances jutting out here and there, no logic to its shape. Only on closer inspection can you see the intersecting wooden beams and the man nailed to them, buried under the odd bulk of the hardened clay. The bodies wind around a tilted crucifix like ribbons on a maypole fallen down. It's difficult to tell where one ends and the next begins. Jesus' dead hand rests on a muscular shoulder. A veiled woman writhes past his forearm, revealing her breasts. The bodies spiral upward from the cross of death at the base of the sculpture to another cross, much smaller, at the top, held by communal effort. Not by a particular body or by many, but as one. That's the message. The medium, however, is far more messy. Up close, the sculpture resembles nothing so much as a game of Twister played on the canvas of a late Gothic crucifixion. Right hand red. A fumbling group grope of revelation. If it's a sacrilege, it's a well-placed one. Via Crucis, the Way of the Cross, stands in a dim hallway of the Archbishop's residence in Brighton, Massachusetts, on the first floor of what was, until recently, one of the most prestigious addresses in the Roman Catholic Church, former home to the highest-ranking prelate in America. The sculpture doesn't at all match the decor of the manse, but still, it's a fitting spot. For all its physicality, its erotic detail, the tangle of bodies is meant to suggest the church itself. The cumulative experience of those whose lives have rested on a single sacrifice, building up through the centuries to a mountain of human endeavor that one day will reach its reward. Yet whatever the artwork is supposed to represent, when I stood in the hallway in which it resides, it seemed unlikely many others had viewed the sculpture of late. A skin of dust covered the pedestal. A faded plaque was all that displayed the artist's name. Along with the usual effects of age and neglect, the piece was rather difficult to see. The whole house, quiet, empty, smelling of freshly vacuumed carpet, was cast in shadows, as if half the light bulbs had burned out at once, or, more likely, as if they were keeping an eye on the electric bill, trying to save a nickel or two wherever they could. This was the spring of 2003. The Archdiocese of Boston had by then paid over $50 million in settlements to victims of sexual abuse by its clergy. They could barely afford what little light was left. My father had an appointment that day to meet with the Archdiocese's interim apostolic administrator, Bishop Richard G. Lennon, acting man in charge after Cardinal Bernard F. Law resigned in disgrace for his role in the abuse scandal. Law had insisted for months he knew nothing of the dangerous histories of the men involved. Then came the documents, his name, his blessing, on transfer after transfer, moving known pedophiles to unsuspecting parishes, sending wolves to tend his flock. It all resulted in a promotion for Lennon, but now he had the unenviable job of cleaning up the mess. I had gone along with Dad that day to offer moral support. With nothing but bad news coming out of the Archbishop's residence lately, he had been understandably anxious about the meeting. Yet it seemed possible at the time that Bishop Lennon agreed to speak with Dad more as a diversion than anything else. Compared with the scandal and the financial crisis it caused, my father should not have presented a pressing matter from the Church's point of view. Dad's errand was merely to find out whether the Catholic hierarchy still considered him a priest. He had been ordained by the Archdiocese of Boston some 40 years before. 8 years later, he had married my mother and had been excommunicated for refusing to resign his priestly status. Somewhere along the way, a change in canon law had reduced his penalty from excommunication to censure, and now, at 67, he was considering getting right with his church. After 34 years as a devoted, if disobedient Catholic married to the same, my father thought it might be time to have his union with my mother recognized by Rome. The church would do no such thing, however, if Dad remained unwilling to bend to its will on the question of his priesthood, his clerical state. In other words, in order to have the primary relationship of his life affirmed by the church he loved, he would have to give up his primary identity within it. It's a kind of sacramental blackmail, not quite damned if you do, damned if you don't, but grace, authority, and even God are at stake if you take this kind of thing seriously. And Dad does. So he wanted to know where he stood and what would be involved in being laicized, or, as the process is also called, dispensed, regularized, reduced. The church has no shortage of terms for spiritual debasement. We were sitting in the worn chairs of a dimly lit waiting area. Dad leaned forward, sat back, crossed and uncrossed his legs, trying to adjust, to settle into his chair and just wait patiently for the bishop to appear. At the far end of the hall, blue light shone from the windows of the small chapel. Blue light on blue carpet, blue light on marble tabletops, blue light on an oak-brown door. "We used to come up here 2 at a time once a week," Dad said. 2 seminarians would go into that chapel to help Cardinal Cushing with his radio broadcast. He'd intone the rosary into his microphone, and it was our job to provide the responses. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee," he'd say, and we'd answer, "Holy Mary, Mother of God." That was the whole show. People actually listened. Dad straightened his glasses, glancing nervously around the hallway. Portraits of cardinals past stared down at us from the opposite wall. Directly in front of us was Richard J. Cushing, Archbishop of Boston from 1944 to 1970. Kennedy's cardinal. He delivered the young man's eulogy. And yet, as late as the 1950s, Cushing wondered why on earth Catholics would choose to attend a place like Harvard when there were more than enough seats at Catholic colleges to go around. The last towering figure of the insular immigrant Catholicism in which my parents were raised, his portrait had a square chin, a large, severe nose, and deep vertical creases cut in his face. Even in his lush red cloak and matching 3-cornered cardinal's hat, he looked like a guy who might have owned a bar in South Boston, Southie, the Irish enclave where he'd been born. "One time I came up here," Dad remembered, "Cardinal Cushing took me aside. He said, 'Bill, come here, come here.'" Dad's voice went gravelly and high at the same time, which surprised me. He is an earnest man, not one for jokes or shtick. I had never heard him try to do a comic voice before. "When I was right up by his side," Dad continued, "he says to me, 'You want to see my operation?'" My ears perked to attention, eyes went wide. Growing up, my family stories had been tales of Catholic peculiarity, with oddball clerics standing in for crazy uncles. I still had a taste for it. Not just for the comedy of the unexpected that my parents' memories of eccentric clergy never failed to provide, the priest dressed up as a Mother Superior one Halloween, the nun who had to be helped out of the rectory after a few too many sips of Tom Collins mix, but for the humanness of all involved, the human clumsiness of the God-minded. The stories I liked best were the ones that showed how anyone putting on the divine was bound to stumble like a toddler scuffing around in his mother's high heels. "Cushing leads me into that conference room right over there," Dad said, "and beside the same enormous table where we'll talk to the bishop today, he opens his shirt up and says, again in that high, gravelly voice, 'I'm full of the cancer. They looked around inside me, but couldn't get it out.'" Dad opened the flap of his suit coat, miming it, though it now seemed he was playing it up more to distract himself than to keep me entertained. All I could think to say was,